but regretted it and wrote to his mother from India. I have to talk about political and economic problems. I take part in receptions where I even have to wear a dinner suit. On top of all this, I'm without a leader, who I couldn't bring because of the many mental complexes I suffer from. In the meantime, in Cuba, the nationalization of foreign enterprises and agrarian expropriations continued to develop. The United States became increasingly worried about the progress of relations between Cuba and the Soviet Union. Differences with Washington became increasingly clear. It was the most serious attack ever on Cuban soil. On March 4th, a French freighter laden with ammunition exploded. The weapons were bought from Belgium. 80 people lost their lives. Fidel Castro accused the United States, which immediately denied responsibility. 2 weeks later, Eisenhower approved a secret plan to overthrow Castro. There was widespread speculation about the United States' hostility towards the harsh methods used by the Cuban Revolution. These images fueled the Cuban anti-Americanism, and Fidel took advantage of the situation to justify his policy. Cuba assumed the image of the victim, and gradually, in the name of national security, the revolution changed face. The Americans radically reduced sugar imports, which provoked a reconciliation with the Soviets. On October 19th, the United States imposed a trade embargo against the island. 3 days after the announcement of the American embargo, Che Guevara left for his first journey to the communist bloc countries. He had to assure the sale of Cuban sugar and to obtain credit for the construction of new factories. In China, he was welcomed with full honors. On the airport runway, Vice President Zhou Enlai received him. But it was in the Soviet Union that Guevara stopped the longest. He visited Moscow, Leningrad, and even found time for some sightseeing. He met an infinite number of people, soldiers and workers. He watched a performance at the Bolshoi Theater. He met Nikita Khrushchev. He was even invited onto the Presidium balcony in Red Square to admire the military parade on November 7th. In the meantime, the atmosphere in Cuba had changed. The state now controlled banks, education, transport, industry, and agriculture. The humanist face of the revolution had become tougher, and well-off Cubans left the country. The anti-Castrist front widened. Opponents of the revolution reorganized. Old soldiers of the Batista dictatorship, landowners and rebel officials of the army. In all, there were 3,000 men. Officially, they were all United States agents. On April 15th, the CIA bombed the airports in Havana and Santiago. 7 people died. The already meager Cuban aviation lost 5 aircraft. It was a time of plots to assassinate Castro, attempts to subvert the new Cuban power with the support of the CIA, and the disastrous expedition to the Bay of Pigs endorsed by the new president, John F. Kennedy. In Havana, heavy artillery was positioned along the Malethon seafront, while 35,000 people were accused of hostile acts against the regime and were detained by the police and revolutionary defense committees. The CIA was hoping that an anti-Castrist insurrection would favor invasion. It didn't turn out that way. August 1961. At Punta del Este in Uruguay, a conference of the Organization of American States was held, and Guevara did everything he could to be noticed. He sent a message to President Kennedy via American journalists. Thanks for Playa Girón, the Bay of Pigs. Before the invasion, the revolution was shaky. Now it's stronger than ever. The United States delegation head's speech was vague and without substance. Guevara had brought the Cold War to Uruguay and attacked the United States.
Lo que hemos denunciado desde hace tiempo, y se medite sobre la responsabilidad internacional que tiene el gobierno de un país que autoriza y facilita el entrenamiento de mercenarios para atacar a Cuba.
The reference to plots financed by the United States was crystal clear, and the consequences were just around the corner. America stopped all aid to countries maintaining relations with Cuba, and several months later, the Organization of American States expelled Cuba. In the meantime, another of Guevara's battles began. He promoted the creation of a new socialist man role model. He called it the New Man, an unselfish and solid figure prepared to give everything for the community. As a demonstration, he launched the volunteer work experiment.
El trabajo voluntario es una escuela creadora de conciencia. Es el esfuerzo realizado en la sociedad y para la sociedad como aporte individual y colectivo, y va formando esa alta conciencia que nos permite acelerar el proceso del tránsito hacia el comunismo.
After the Bay of Pigs, Castro was convinced that the United States was preparing to invade Cuba, and he asked Moscow for military protection. Whose idea was it to install nuclear missiles on the island? Castro's or Khrushchev's? The Cubans said it was the Soviets, and vice versa. Che began to realize that the Soviet Union was a country full of defects, and he felt increasingly frustrated in dealing with them. He wanted to build a steelworks in Cuba. He wanted the Soviets to help Cuba develop the spirit of socialist egalitarianism and solidarity among comrades. He wanted to be supported in his idea of creating the new man, the true communist, and he wanted Cuba to be free at last. He failed to accomplish any of these things, and a conflict arose between Che Guevara and the orthodox Cuban communists that backed Moscow. October 1962. In Cuban waters, there was the threat of another world war. It was the missile crisis, and the Castro Revolution realized it was a pawn in a very big chess game. For Guevara, it was the sign that something had changed. His initial enthusiasm for the Soviet model had faded.